So, what are the frontal lobes? What role do they play? They control a lot of different things, including language, motor function, and social behavior. It's the largest lobe in the human and mammal brain, makes up 2/3 of the entire brain. Primates have been found to have the largest and most complex. It essentially is the part of the brain that makes us who we are. It's what gives us individual qualities and sensibilities. Why I love the frontal lobes. This comes back to the individuality and forming of personality. In cases where the frontal lobes have been damaged, personality is monumentally affected, and referred to as frontal lobe syndrome. This does not always correlate with traditional IQ testing, but personality of the individual. So this brings up the question of convergent versus divergent thinking. People are still able to think critically, but they don't really have the capacity to have emotional responses in most cases where the frontal lobe is damaged. And this is an example of divergent thinking being limited. Damage to the frontal lobe and the frontal lobe in general is historically associated with mental illness, which I am particularly interested in. It's been found that damage to the left frontal lobe can result in speaking less, while damage to the right can result in speaking excessively. Personality is affected differently depending on the region that was damaged, region of the frontal lobe. The left results often in pseudo-depression, while damage to the right lobe results in pseudo-psychopathic. I feel like everybody hears like horror stories about lobotomies, and a lot of people probably think that still goes on today, which they really don't. Lobotomies were really an effect of a lack of science in the early 20th century, before medication really developed in like the 1950s. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, starring Jack Nicholson, and eventually he undergoes a frontal lobotomy at the psych ward because of his like aggressive behavior. He's basically considered dead. And then a similar thing happened in the case of Phineas Gage. He didn't receive a lobotomy, but he was accidentally impaled by an iron rod through his brain and his frontal lobe, but he survived, with the only side effects being the loss of his eye and a dramatic change in his personality. He was still able to walk and talk while most of his left frontal lobe was destroyed by the iron rod, but he was a completely different man, which shows the effects that the frontal lobe has on personality. To talk more about lobotomy, this procedure was developed in the 1930s to treat mental illness as a result of overcrowding mental institutions. Since like ancient times, like they used to think that like putting a hole in a person's skull would release the evil spirits. So this notion's been around for a long time, but there was no actual like surgical action until the 1930s. In 1935, Dr. John F. Fulton performed bilateral resections of the prefrontal cortex on 2 chimpanzees, and both chimpanzees became devoid of emotional expression. This was the birth of what we now know as the frontal lobe syndrome, which I mentioned earlier. And this syndrome was eventually divided by 3 frontal subcortical circuit syndromes. So these are like 3 different areas of the frontal lobe, which each have different effects on personality. Like Phineas Gage is an example of the orbitofrontal syndrome, which is the most well-known. It's like someone experiences damage to their frontal lobe, and they go from like a well-mannered, civilized person to like a very impulsive and dangerous person. Alzheimer's, like things that kind of spread in the brain, it's harder to predict which personality changes may occur. Interior cingulate and dorsolateral syndromes, which are on the opposite end of the personality spectrum in that they make the subject more withdrawn and apathetic. So this is what you see with lobotomies. The person kind of becomes like a zombie. Oh yeah, like I said, Phineas Gage is a good example of orbitofrontal syndrome, while Randall McMurphy, who received the lobotomy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is the anterior cingulate syndrome, because lobotomies are performed on the anterior part of the frontal lobe.